Welcome back to the Bible Nerd Show, where we believe that understanding the Bible in its historic, geographic, religious, and cultural context helps us see Jesus more clearly, love him more dearly, and follow him more nearly day by day. And today, we're a preacher, a teacher, and your average Joe talking about season 1, episode 0 of The Chosen. It's the shepherd. It's the Christmas one. So we're going to be diving in and talking about our thoughts, give it our ratings, and I think David's got some context to place into this. So I'm excited about that. So how are you guys doing?
Good, getting ready for Christmas. Family stuff coming in town. The sons finished up school for the semester, and they're living their life and that kind of stuff. What about you? You guys got anything fun going on for Christmas this weekend?
We're guarding the Christmas tree because we have a walker now. He's just about to turn 16 months old, is doing the Frankenstein monster toddler walk, arms out, and it's complete with him like now screaming and like grunting whenever he's getting close. So it's a full on like seems like baby Frankenstein's monster. So he's fascinated with the tree and with the little ornaments on the tree. Not really that interested in the presents, so we're having to try to redirect. That's what our Christmas I think is going to look like. So I'm excited about it.
That's that's going to be a natural redirect. It's like, oh, the presents are more fun.
Oh, we'll see. He's the kid that's way more entertained by the box than he is the toy right now.
Wow.
So yeah,
it's fun stuff. Yeah, I don't know if this has happened with you guys. Like, so we do a Christmas tree every year, and I feel like every year the trees get worse and worse. They're like drier and more, or maybe it's I'm in Denver now, but it's the trees just dry out. Mine is like it's ready for the fire right now, I think.
I've got that OCD wife that won't let us get a real tree.
Oh,
so we have to have the perfect.
I think we're going to switch to that. I think from now on, we're going to follow her lead because it's just getting worse every year, I feel like.
Bro, the artificial tree is way cheaper, and everybody in your house doesn't have to wake up and take a Zyrtec just to survive today. So
that's funny. We're like the family. I'd get a tag and go like cut one down, from out in the mountains.
I'm so surprised.
Yeah, I know. Adventurous. But yeah, I think we got to switch to the other one. I couldn't believe this year how expensive the trees were. So someone's gonna have to drop in the comments, like, have you noticed in your area the price of your Christmas tree going up? I couldn't even believe it. So
yeah. So anyway. I'm just curious to see, like how much the trees cost in Bethlehem, 2000 years ago on Christmas Day, December 25th.
Exactly. What did they even decorate the trees with?
Well, only the pagans did, but that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother podcast. So anyway,
it feels like it could be appropriate here. Well, it'll be fun. Well, let's talk about the episode. The episode was a shorter episode. We, follow Joseph and Mary as they're making their way, to Bethlehem and kind of see how everything's going. But I'd love to hear you guys' overall impressions of the episode, kind of high level thoughts.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. The character of Simon, not the Simon that we see in the rest of The Chosen, not Simon Peter, but this crippled shepherd named Simon, who is on the outcasts of society, on the fringes of society. He's not welcome in the synagogue there in Bethlehem. He's being rejected by the religious leaders, and yet he's that's the group, even if it's not this individual, that's this personification of the shepherds that we see in this. That's the group that received the message first, and came to see Jesus in the manger, and I love that. I think they captured that really, really well.
That's good. Lucas, what about you?
Christmas trees in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania are going between $100 and $500, but they're sold out for the season. No, I enjoyed it. I think it's an interesting take, and doing something like this, especially because when you listened to Dallas Jenkins talk about how The Chosen got started is it was something fun that they did for their church, and then it kind of evolved into this other thing. If this was the production level of something that was being done for, my church to just be shown on at a either maybe a Sunday morning service or for our candlelight services or the Christmas pageant or something like that. I think for that purpose, this is absolutely stellar. That the storytelling is a lot of fun and interesting, and that it sets a great tone for everything else that would happen that night. So I really dug it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I just again, as per usual, the storytelling is stellar. You guys know I'm easy to please when it comes to this stuff. But I think when they're getting into some of the storytelling that we read stories that we're so familiar with, and I think that's one of the beauties of The Chosen and what they've done is taking that which just feels very familiar and like reintroducing it in our lives. And like you said, David, like thinking about things in this context. The shepherds. Why was somebody a shepherd? Part of it. Well, I'll ask you, like when someone's a shepherd in Bethlehem or around that area, how did that come to be? Because they were not thought of as like they're not the most highly thought of people or citizens, right? So what was their life like? Like, what's their daily life like? Even Bedouin shepherds today, it's not, they don't live an existence like what we might experience right now. So how did that show up for you, as you're watching the episode? What were some of the things that stuck out to you, like, this feels really culturally, contextually accurate, or were there some misses?
I thought that there was a lot of there's magic in this, and when you think about the fact that Lucas kind of alluded to it there in his comments, when you think about the fact that this came out 2 years before The Chosen first season 1 episode 1 that we started this whole conversation with, that this was an experiment. They captured the magic that you find in The Chosen in that 20 some minutes with it. You've got contextually it fits, right? You've got a very small town. You don't have this massive city with Bethlehem. They grasped that. They captured that. They've got the religious elitism that you find in the synagogue that was beautifully done there. You've got the idea of Simon and these shepherds being the lowest of the low in society. It's funny. I've joked a couple of times about my, how sometimes pastors don't get context right, and I've made some cracks about that with this. And my own pastor's like, man, I wonder what what he thinks about me. But yeah, just yesterday in our church services, my pastor was specifically addressing the issue of the shepherds, and he was talking about this, and he nailed it, right? So the shepherds never get a Sabbath. They never get a break. They are constantly unclean. They're constantly dirty. They're constantly among these animals, and the religious society saw them as perpetually unworthy. To be in the synagogue, to go to the temple, which is ironic because the very sheep that they're caring for are most likely the sheep being used in the daily sacrifices at the temple. And they captured that really well in this. The idea of the sheep that Simon brings to them that's unclean and all of this and kind of being criticized for it. All of that they captured really, really well. So while it's not at the same level as The Chosen as a real series was, the magic is there. And I thought that was beautiful.
Yeah, I for sure. I think that's the case. And you can tell the production quality is not quite as high. Like it looks a little bit more like a set, across certain things. But again, the storytelling, just that's the part that is magical, I think. Lucas, what are you, from a pastoral perspective, this you said, great to play, on the screen if you've got a, congregation that's there. But what are your deeper thoughts like for pastors with this episode?
So if we're gonna like dive into our normal stuff and we look at the biblical rating and all of those kinds of things, there's not much there, but I think for the purposes that this was made, this is something that I would show at my church annually because
Mm.
it gives a different and really very special perspective on who Jesus is, who he was to the people that were looking for him. And I want to bounce something off of David here because the numbers that I get are really mixed. That 20% of Israel or the Israelites that are practicing Israelites, let's say that, actually believe that the Old Testament are or is true, right? That they're actually looking for a literal Messiah that's going to come and do those things instead of the figurative. And so maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 40%, or maybe it is 25. And I think that from what I've seen, that looks like it was intentionally done with the shepherds, that there is this one of four that believes that the Messiah is coming, that is looking for the Messiah, that goes and talks to the priest about the Messiah. And the other three are like, you know what? Okay, yeah, we learned that maybe he's supposed to come, but they don't really buy it. And is that an accurate depiction of kind of what the Hebrew world looks like in terms of practicing Jewish people of belief?
Are we talking about in the first century
Well,
period, or are we talking about now?
but let's do both.
Okay. Well, as far as now goes, it's amazing to see, and Joe and have experienced this in Israel, right? So Israel is very religious, right? Judaism is the cultural thing when you're in Israel, and even among the Jewish people and the diaspora around the world today. It's Joe and I have a very good friend that we know that's Jewish, and he just finished up celebrating Hanukkah, and he and I were having conversations last week about him celebrating Hanukkah. I don't know if he considers himself a very religious person at all with it, but I do think that he keeps the feasts and those types of things. And in Israel, everything shuts down for Sabbath, especially the closer you get to Jerusalem, the more intense that is. Everything shuts down for Passover. Everything shuts down for Day of Atonement. Everything shuts down for Sukkot. Or everyone participates in all of those. And yet, when you understand the viewpoint of the Jewish people, especially in Israel, I would say that my understanding, the numbers that I've heard, are less than 5% would actually consider themselves religious and would consider themselves people that believe in the God of the Hebrew Scriptures. With that, and so all of that together creates for just a cultural Judaism, right? Which isn't very different than what a lot of us experience here in the United States with Christianity. It's a cultural Christianity. Everyone's going to celebrate Christmas this weekend. Everyone's going to, acknowledge the birth of Jesus and those types of things. And yet most people are not religious and would not say that they believe in Scripture. When you go back to the first century, there was the reality of what they had experienced for 700 plus years before the time of the birth of Christ. And that was the temple destroyed, the people exiled, the northern kingdom, those 10 tribes scattered to the nations and never regathered. The group that returns to Judea, to Jerusalem after the Babylonian Empire, under the Persian Empire, is a very small remnant that returns. And by the time you get to the birth of Christ, you've got different camps. You've got the Sadducees, which we've talked about previously on this show. The Sadducees, who are Torah only legalists, and they don't believe in a Messiah, and they run the religious system of Israel at that time. They are the ones that control the temple. They are the ones that control the sacrificial system. They are the ones that are in league with Rome and the empire that's ruling over them, even though they're in their own land. And so that influences.
They would not have believed in any kind of Messiah at all.
No, they didn't believe in the Messiah in any way.
So it's just do the sacrifices. This is how we're made right with God. Is do the sacrifices, follow Torah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's no messianic expectation from the Sadducees, and they were the ruling religious party, and they had been for several hundred years. That group, going all the way back to what they were called the Zadokим and everything else during the intertestamental period, that 400 years between the end of the Old Testament, the beginning of the New Testament. You have the Pharisees; these are the religious, zealots that had, as I think we mentioned this on a previous episode, had returned, settled into the Galilee area about 150 years before Christ. And they were ones that they were very messianic in their belief system. They believed that the Messiah was going to come, but they didn't necessarily always believe that the Messiah was going to be a political ruler. And there was always a lot of different interpretations as to what the Messiah would be. So all of that kind of enters into coloring the way the people would have thought. Then you've got whole groups of people like the Herodians, which are secular Jews, and they have turned their back on any religious system whatsoever, and they are Roman in nature, and they don't want a Messiah. They don't believe in a Messiah. They don't want a Messiah. They're ready to move on. Let's stay under the Roman Empire. Let's celebrate this. Let's move forward with it. You've got all of these groups. You've got the Zealots that are wanting to throw out the Romans, and they may be religious. They may not be, but let's just get rid of the Romans with it. So all of those groups are vying for the hearts of the people at this point. So whether or not it was 25% or 20 or 30, I've never heard statistics on that, but the idea of the Messiah was one that was well understood and discussed and rarely agreed upon among the people as to whether or not he was real, and if he came, what that would look like.
Yeah. It's just one of those things that's fascinating to me, because I think in the church in the West, we have this idea that all the Jewish people are not just culturally Jewish but religiously Jewish, and have been forever, and that because of that they're all looking for the Messiah, and we just don't understand why they don't recognize that it's Jesus, when the case is that particularly among the Jewish people that are in Israel, and even those that are in pockets here in the United States where we see those Jewish communities, which I think the further south you go, the smaller the number of religiously Jewish people are. There's some of them that don't take the messianic prophecies literally, and that are purely cultural. And I think that pointing it out that it's the same as we are probably going to have, of the 330 million something people in the United States, we'll probably have 300 million of them that celebrate some type of thing on Christmas Day that has to do more with a calendar holiday than it does with the birth of the Savior. And I think that's an interesting comparison. When we look at Luke chapter 2 and kind of what lined up here, from a biblical context perspective, there's two things that stand out to me: the shepherds, and there was a baby that was born. Outside of that, everything else is kind of that like poetic liberty and license. The reading of Malachi, the readings from Ezekiel, or I think Simon mentions Ezekiel, and then the reading from Isaiah that's done. Those are great. They're beautiful messianic prophecies. But Joe, what's my rating system for this week, for this episode?
So I think we've got a few choices, the obvious ones. We've got mangers, we've got swaddling cloths, but as David mentioned earlier, I think we're going to go with Simon's lambs.
Okay, great. Yeah, I out of 5 for a biblical context, I'm going to give this 3 Simon's lambs. There's not a lot to compare biblically to what they're doing outside of there were shepherds that saw an angel in the field and that a baby was born. But let me couple that with saying that I loved this episode.
That's good. Yeah, and I'll go next. I mean, again, I'm super easy to please, but I'm also comparing this to all the other episodes that we've seen, and so I think like the stagecraft and costumes and all that kind of stuff is definitely a part of the telling of the story, and because that's lacking in these, I've got to give it some demotion for that. So I'm going to do 4 Simon's lambs for the storytelling aspects for this episode. David, what about for you?
when it comes to context, I think that I'm going to fall right into that same level of it. We've got a good understanding of what the shepherds were like. We've got a good cultural context that was with that. I'm trying to remember, because I've watched this episode several weeks ago and then sort of recapped it this morning in order to prepare for our recording, and I'm trying to remember the way that they portray the birthplace. Is it sort of your traditional stable cave type approach? I'm trying to remember that.
It's stable. It's not a cave, but it is certainly stable-esque.
Yeah, I think that's interesting with it. It's not the way we want it to be, because we are so married to our images from nativity plays and Christmas carols and all of those types of things. But contextually, most scholars of that era have a very different perspective now on what the birthplace would have been, and all of that. Not necessarily, when I went to Israel 15 plus years ago, the first time, everybody was talking about the caves, right? And so everybody would go to the caves, and you'd go to outside of Bethlehem and you'd find a cave, and that would be the context for it. But that's not what modern scholarship would agree it was. It was the first floor of a home in that, culturally, contextually, if Joseph is returning to the city of his family and he comes to that village and he has a pregnant wife, the level of hospitality that is so central to the culture of the first century Jewish mind would not have permitted them to be born in, relegated to a stable off to the side. There was most of the homes in that area would have been 2 stories, and you would have most people sleeping in the second story, and then animals being kept within the first floor of that. And they would have had, if there was any guest rooms within that second level that had not been already occupied by other family members having to return to the city of David before this massive census that was taking place, then where would Joseph and Mary have to stay? Where would anyone have to stay? They would have stayed in that first floor area because that was what was available. And yet we have in our minds, Linus as the innkeeper in A Charlie Brown Christmas, where the innkeeper doesn't even exist in Scripture. There's nowhere in the Bible where there is an innkeeper. There's no room for the inn, and the inn would have been considered a guest room in the second level. With that, there wasn't like a hotel like the Ramada, Bethlehem, and it was no vacancy sign, and so they had to go find a barn somewhere, and that's what we say. So when you think about all of those different pieces of it, for me, the nerd would have wanted that to have been brought out. But if you're using this for a Christmas Eve service that you're producing for your church, the last thing the pastor wants to do is have to address all of those emails on Christmas Day with it. So he's not gonna change that up, and that's kind of what we had here. So I'll give it a 3.
Threes across the board. That's funny, David. So now, as you're saying that, what it makes me think is how many other babies were born in a stable with the manger being the bed? Like, Jesus was likely not the only child that was born. If the census was as large as it was and as many people were coming to Bethlehem as they were, is there a chance that there were other babies born in a stable, or in
I
the
would say
first
yes
floor?
and no, though, because you've got to remember that Bethlehem is not a major city. It's a tiny village, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at this point, who knows how many people came there? It's the same thing with the slaughter of the innocents with Herod, right? We think of this being something that, one of the big arguments against the slaughter of the innocents being a historical fact is that it's not recognized anywhere in any ancient writings outside of Matthew. Right? No one else acknowledges that this ever happened. There's no other historical document that ever acknowledges that this happened. And so people will use that, skeptics will use that to say it's inaccurate or it wasn't actually something that occurred. And yet the reality is there may have only been a couple of dozen children that were killed
Oh, it's
And
interesting.
it wouldn't have been hundreds and hundreds or thousands. And Herod did this stuff all the time. Herod was horrible. And so, there was a lot more things that Herod did that got documented because they were more significant and massive. And in the ancient world, Herod killing a dozen kids,
Like, not
that's
a big
terrible, but it's
wasn't there
not something.
wasn't there
Yeah.
something when he died, he like had people murdered just to make sure that there were people who were crying when he died or something
He had
like that?
the most prominent religious leaders arrested before his death. And when word got to all of them that Herod was killed, they were instructed to slaughter these so that the people would mourn, the people
Wow.
would grieve on the day of his death.
Did they do
And
that?
they did it.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
That's how brutal this dude was.
yeah, he had his own son killed in front of him whenever he was sick and bedridden because
Wow.
his son made a decision without asking him about it.
Yeah,
Like,
it's
So, yeah.
the statement
Dude,
was made at the time of Herod that it's safer to be a pig in Herod's kingdom than it is to be his own family member, because at least as being a practicing Jew, he won't eat the pig. So it's likely not going to get slaughtered, but your own family members would be. But here's another piece of context that we don't really think about with this is Herod, had this, he did have a fear about the coming of the Messiah. He did understand what some of these prophecies were, and he was constantly worried about the security of his throne. And so that's why he built places, like he built a fortress along the sea, or along the Mediterranean Sea, which we've been there, Joe.
Yeah.
He built Masada, which is one of the just the most amazing places in all of Israel. We don't talk about the other one that he built so often, which is the Herodium. And the Herodium is within, you can see it from Bethlehem. And he literally, there were two mountains next to each other that weren't large enough to house what he wanted to build. So he had dirt brought in to shore up the gap between those. He literally moved a mountain outside of Jerusalem in order to build the Herodium, and he put forces there. And this is, you can see it from Bethlehem. You look at the Herodium and it overlooks Bethlehem. And the forces that were sent to kill these children, the slaughter of the innocents, were probably from the Herodium. And so all of these things, Herod, you can't understand the story of the birth of Christ without really truly understanding Herod. And that's another piece of context that they could not have brought in to this.
Right.
I mean, this should have been a 3-hour movie.
Right.
It was a 20-minute, thing, and so all of that is influencing the story. So
Right.
or it
But
could
just
have
from
been,
the
Lecrae.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Lucas.
I said, or it could have been a musical with Lecrae.
or maybe not. So that, yeah, just a side note, what the description on, I think it was IMDb was of that. It was the Nativity Story, which I think is a really good movie, but it gets terrible reviews. But anyway, it's got Oscar Isaac in it. It's fantastic. I check it out every year. Anyway, it's the Nativity Story meets High School Musical with that. So that's probably
rough
one to skip. Let's skip that one this year. So okay.
So I think it's interesting, David, that you bring up, like, people would question the slaughter of the innocents, but they know historically that Herod be willing to do these terrible things. So yeah, it would be certainly in his nature to have that done, for fear of that going on. And I think some of the things I think, and I've heard people talk about this before, just like, when Jesus came, and was born here, people missed it and people weren't looking for it. Some people were longing for it for a long time, and it's finally here. And we certainly see that in all the episodes with The Chosen, where it's like, this is the one, they're acknowledging this. And I think today, here we are 2,000 years later, and I think we've got this esoteric idea that there is a second coming of Jesus, and we're just living our life day to day like it's I think for most of us, like it's never actually going to happen. But there is going to be this moment where this happens, and I can't imagine the joy that would bring, and also probably the confusion, where there's a lot of people, like a lot of different philosophies and thoughts about it. So
that ties directly to what Lucas was asking earlier, right? Because anyone that has any understanding of the different perspectives on the return of Christ would say there is no unity among those that claim themselves to be followers of Jesus. There's very little unity as to what that looks like, when it can happen, what has to happen first, what's going to happen afterwards. And that same mindset regarding the second advent would have applied to the coming of the Messiah at the first advent. Lots of different perspectives, lots of different interpretations as to what that would look like. And the reality is, until he came, no one could know exactly what was going to happen with that. And so that's one of the things, that's a really important distinction to bring in to help us understand the mindset of first century Judaism.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the moment. What was the moment for you guys? Lucas, what was the moment for you in this episode?
When Simon got his arm bandaged, that was the moment for me, because Simon hurts his arm when he falls in front of the Pharisee. He gets miraculously healed as he's running and beats the other shepherds to Jesus, or to the the nativity scene. They go in first. He's the one that's able to hold the baby. They recognize him. He holds the baby Jesus, and all of that was pretty incredible to me as I'm watching that. And then when Joseph hands him something to get rid of the scrape that's on his arm, that for me was the moment, because like the thing that he needed healed the most was to no longer be lame. But that didn't mean that everything was okay. And that really, from a pastoral perspective, and if we're showing this on a Sunday morning, or we're showing this at a candlelight service or something like this, that is exactly where I go with the the application for the sermon. If I'm going to take this and use it as a sermon illustration, 100%. Christ healed. Just the coming of the Messiah was able to heal Israel of what it needed to have happen, which was that its redemption was made available. But that didn't mean that everything was perfect. And I loved that part for two reasons. One is that it did show that he's the need that he had most physically was to be able to walk, to be able to keep up in order to perform his job. But that there were still bumps and scrapes that happened along the way that needed to be tended to. And then second was, I really think, particularly for Joseph, it shows the type of character that we would want to project onto Joseph. Joseph was a righteous man. We don't know a ton about him, but that even in the midst of his wife giving birth, that the Messiah is there, that he is someone who is consistently looking and caring for others. And I say, hey, you're wounded, give me something to clean that up, and here's a bandage for you. I thought that was my moment. I loved it. And one of those, again, when you look at why this episode was created, one of the things that I'm watching, and Kirsten's sitting next to me, and she's like, hey, that'll preach. I'm like, yeah, absolutely, 100%. So yeah, I thought that was great. And this episode, like I said, from a biblical context perspective, it's probably the one that I've rated the lowest, but I loved it for what it was made for. It's something I would show to my congregation every year. So then in this moment, and because of the application that it would give to piggyback off of sermons, so it really does hit all of the marks for what it was supposed to do, what it was designed to do and created for. This one's a 5 out of 5 for me, even though it doesn't live up to the production standards and stuff of the rest of the series. Knowing the intent behind why this episode was created, I think it's wonderful.
That's awesome. David, how about for you?
I think the moment for me is at the very ending, right? So you've got the shepherds leaving after having seen Jesus, and they're leaving, and they're going and they're telling everyone what happened, what they've seen with this. And then you hear this priest, the same priest that had rejected Simon's lamb earlier because he wasn't without blemish, right? He wasn't perfect, right? This priest is now asking where the lamb for the sacrifice is, and you see this knowing smile come across Simon's face. This idea of, yeah, I know where that lamb, that spotless lamb, and it kind of ties in. Again, if you're looking at using this in a church setting, it then immediately goes and you're transported to John 1, where John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And so I feel like that's a really special moment in that, and I love that.
Like where he has this knowing that this
Yeah.
powerful person doesn't even know.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
So how many Simon's Lambs would you give the moment?
I give it like 3.5.
3.5.
With it was good. It was great. Again, knowing what this was originally intended to be, it's fantastic. But in the relation to the rest of season 1, with it just doesn't hold it. It doesn't measure up to that level.
Right. Yeah. So mine was the same moment again, and probably for the reason that I said, it's like the religious elites and these people who actually held themselves out to be that much better than the people who are around them, especially a lowly shepherd. And for the lowly shepherd to have experienced what he experienced, dropping his staff and running and being tended to by Joseph, like all of these things, like you can't. And I think this is like, just for your average Joe that's out there, we may not know everything that there is to know about the scripture. We may not know all the context and have all of that, but you can't argue somebody's testimony. You can't argue what God has done in and through people. And so I think, that's what we see with this lowly shepherd, is his testimony, is his experience, his lived experience with that. So I'd give it a little bit higher, David. I'd give it a 4 for me in that moment. Again, same kind of reason. So, okay. So how many Simon's Lambs does that bring us to? I think I had 2 4s.
I've got them. You had 2 4s.
I think the first one was a 4 and the moment was a 4.
Okay. So that brings us to 23.5 for this one.
23.5. Yep. Simon's Lambs. Okay.
Is our lowest rated episode.
It was a short episode. They didn't have it for a lot of different reasons.
Pilot, right? It's not uncommon for the pilot to not be the best episode in a season.
Right. And I don't see it being promoted as much either, because sometimes, like, pilots, people will go and watch it. I don't see this as like super promoted on everything.
Right. Well, actually, it's all over. It's in theaters.
Right now it is.
Right now, they've got this combination of that and some music videos for different casts and stars singing different Christmas songs interspersed, and they've released it. They call it the Christmas with the Chosen, and it's in theaters. You can watch it with that, and they've done that a couple of years now in different ways. And so, yeah, they are promoting it. My Nathan, who's my son, who's also one of the one that edits this show, so he'll get a kick out of me throwing him out there now. He keeps coming. He's like, "Are you guys going to go and make a big deal and watch the Chosen in theater, Christmas in theaters?" I'm like, no, we're probably not. So,
or apparently won't even know about it. So,
right. So,
and they did a live
good
stream a few days ago, I think, too, that had a bunch of people doing Christmas carols and stuff like that. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Well, good job, Chosen. Good job getting us brought into the Christmas story in a really unique way. So, well, next week, make sure to join us, a preacher, a teacher, and your average Joe. Look at the Chosen season 1, episode 8, the season finale. I am he. So after a miraculous visit to Simon's house, Jesus and his students leave Capernaum while under pressure from the religious and Roman authorities. Jesus makes a surprise stop at Jacob's well for an important encounter. So, Lucas, before we sign off, how can people become part of the conversation with us here?
And if you want to be part of the conversation with us, you can go check out our Bible Nerds Show Facebook group on Facebook, or leave a comment on YouTube. Let us know, how do you rate episode 0 of The Chosen? Do you think that the nativity was in a cave or on the first floor of or are you in this boat with the rest of us, that you didn't really realize how few people may have actually been looking for the Messiah? And now that you know that, how does that impact how you view the revelation of the Holy Spirit that Jesus is the Messiah in your life. Leave us comments. Let us know. We'd love to be able to talk with you, converse with you about all of those things. So check it out.
All right. Well, until next time, stay nerdy.